My name is Gerald Whitmore, and I am 76 years old, though at times I feel much older, as if the weight of decades has pressed down upon my shoulders until even the smallest movement requires an effort of will, and at other times I feel curiously suspended in a kind of agelessness, where memory stretches back so vividly that my boyhood seems closer than the morning's breakfast, yet the mirror tells me without mercy that those years are long gone. I live in the same house where my late wife Margaret and I raised our 2 children, a modest but sturdy home at the edge of a small Midwestern town, built with my own hands during evenings and weekends when I was still working at the factory, and saving every dollar to carve out a permanent place for us in the world. That house, with its weather-worn porch and the oak tree that bends slightly toward the roof, has become the last unshakable witness to my life, a container of memories both tender and bitter, and a space that still carries the scent of Margaret's cooking, the sound of our children's quarrels and laughter, and the quiet of long evenings we spent side by side after the children were asleep, listening to the old radio or planning how we would afford college tuition one day. Since Margaret passed away nearly 8 years ago, the house has changed in ways that only I can sense. To a stranger it might look shabby, in need of a coat of paint and a new fence, but to me every creak in the floorboards speaks with her voice. Every curtain she sewed with her careful hands still hangs as a testament to her presence, and every photograph on the wall insists that time cannot erase what we lived together. I have done my best to keep things orderly, though age has slowed me and my eyesight is not what it once was. But there is still pride in sweeping the porch, polishing the brass doorknob, and cutting the grass on summer mornings. For in these small acts I feel connected not only to my wife but also to the younger man I used to be, full of purpose and faith in the idea that a family, once built, would endure unbroken. My daily routine is simple, though it has a rhythm that comforts me. I rise early, usually before the sun has fully touched the tops of the maples on our street, and I shuffle into the kitchen where the smell of coffee, even when brewed by my clumsy hands, still brings back the memory of Margaret humming softly as she set the percolator on the stove. Breakfast is plain, oatmeal or eggs if I feel ambitious, and then I sit at the table with the newspaper, though more often than not the words blur and I find myself staring into the distance, thinking not of world affairs but of small details from the past, the way Margaret's hair smelled of lilacs after she washed it, the time our son fell from his bicycle and she rushed out with a dish towel to bandage his knee, or the summer evening when the 4 of us ate watermelon on the porch and laughed until our stomachs ached. These memories rise without invitation, and though they sometimes sting, I cling to them because they are proof that I once belonged fully to a family, that I was more than an old man waiting for the days to end. My son Patrick, now in his 40s, has a forceful presence that fills every room he enters. He was once a boy who tugged at my sleeve and asked endless questions about engines, tools, and the way the world worked. But somewhere along the way his curiosity hardened into something sterner, a determination to be in control, to prove himself superior not only at work but within the family as well. He built a business of his own, and though I once admired his ambition, I've grown wary of the way he carries himself, as if every conversation were a negotiation and every gesture a transaction. His wife Denise has a polished smile that rarely reaches her eyes, and though I tried in the beginning to welcome her as a daughter, I have long sensed that she regards me less as kin and more as an obstacle standing between her and the property on which this house sits. My daughter, Claire, lives several states away, and though she calls on birthdays and holidays, her voice always carries the hurried tone of someone with little time to spare. I do not blame her entirely. She has children of her own and a demanding career, but the distance has meant that my connection to her life is filtered through quick updates, leaving me with photographs on the mantelpiece rather than real encounters. In truth, my relationship with Patrick has become the central force shaping these later years, and not for the better. He visits often, sometimes with his family, and at first I took comfort in their presence, thinking that the house might once again resound with laughter and daily noise. But I soon realized that his visits carried a different intention, a kind of subtle invasion that grew heavier as months passed. Loneliness is not something one admits easily, especially for a man who has prided himself on independence, but it has been my quiet companion since Margaret's death. Friends from the factory either passed away or moved to warmer climates, neighbors changed, and the church community that once anchored my weeks has dwindled as I found it harder to climb the steps and keep up with gatherings. I do not crave attention or constant company, yet I have longed for gestures of genuine affection for my children, for an embrace offered freely, for a question asked out of concern rather than convenience. What I have received instead, particularly from Patrick, is a kind of managerial attention, as if I were no longer a father but a responsibility to be dealt with. This subtle shift in the way he regards me has eaten away at the trust that once bound us, leaving me uncertain whether the man who comes through my front door is still the boy I raised, or a stranger wearing his face. In the evenings, I often sit on the porch and watch the light fade over the neighborhood, the same porch where Margaret and I once whispered about our dreams and where our children once argued over who got the bigger piece of pie. Now the silence is broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant sound of a passing train. It is in these moments that I feel both the deepest peace and the sharpest sorrow. Peace, because the house still holds me in its embrace. Sorrow, because I sense the storm gathering just beyond the horizon of my quiet life. A storm carried in the footsteps of my own son. For though I do not yet know exactly what shape his intentions will take, I have begun to feel them pressing at the edges of my days, unsettling the fragile order I have built, and threatening to turn this house of memory into a battleground where dignity, love, and betrayal will clash. It began quietly, almost innocently, as so many decisive turns in life often do, with Patrick standing in my kitchen one Sunday afternoon after the family had finished a heavy meal that left the table scattered with plates and half-empty glasses, and his voice carrying that careful tone he adopts when he wants to disguise a command as a suggestion. He leaned back in the chair where his mother once sat, stretched his arms as though testing the air, and told me that his house was becoming too cramped, that Denise had grown tired of juggling space between their two teenage boys and the constant demands of her home-based work, that the city had become too expensive, and that it might be practical for everyone's comfort if they spent some time living here with me until they managed to buy a larger place. At first I thought he was joking, because the house that had once held 4 of us easily could now hold 6 only with difficulty. But as I watched the seriousness settle into his expression, I realized he was not asking in the spirit of a child, returning home for a brief refuge, but in the way of a man laying claim to something he already considered half his own. I hesitated, not because I feared the noise or the intrusion, though I did, but because something in his eyes made me feel as if the question was already answered, as if my consent were merely a formality he expected me to give. Still, the idea of having family in the house again touched a lonely place in me, and I told myself that perhaps the laughter of grandchildren would soften the silence that had hung over these rooms since Margaret's death, that perhaps the presence of daily life would chase away the shadows of grief that settled too easily in corners. So I agreed, though my voice caught a little, and he smiled in triumph rather than gratitude, which should have warned me. Within 2 weeks, a moving van was parked outside, and my quiet routines were upended by the arrival of boxes, furniture, and the determined footsteps of people who regarded the house less as a sanctuary and more as a staging ground for their own ambitions. At first there were gestures of politeness, Denise thanking me for letting them stay, the boys calling me Grandpa with forced enthusiasm, Patrick promising that it was all temporary until their finances stabilized. But soon the tone shifted. Furniture was rearranged without asking. Margaret's china was pushed aside to make room for Denise's gleaming set, and my evenings on the porch were interrupted by Patrick's loud phone calls to business partners, as if the house itself were now his office. I told myself these were small adjustments, part of the price of family togetherness, but the unease grew sharper when I noticed that the locks on the back door had been changed, the spare key that had always rested in the top drawer of the hall. The table vanished, and my own bedroom door was the only one without a lock at all. When I asked about it, Patrick laughed lightly, saying it was for security, that neighborhoods had changed and I was too old to notice, but I could not shake the sense that the locks were not to keep strangers out, but to keep me under quiet control. The first real wound came when I found my armchair in the living room replaced by a sleek leather couch that looked as if it belonged in a showroom rather than a home, and when I asked where the chair had gone, Patrick said with a dismissive wave that it was too worn out, too dangerous for an old man's back, and that he had hauled it to the curb. That chair had been mine since the early days of my marriage, worn by the shape of my body, and it was where I had cradled my children when they were sick, and where I had sat with Margaret through winter nights, yet it was discarded without a thought. I wanted to shout, to demand its return, but I swallowed the anger because the boys were there, and I did not want them to see their grandfather humiliated. That night I could not sleep, and for the first time in years I felt like a guest in my own home. The weeks that followed brought a steady erosion of boundaries. Denise took over the kitchen, telling me gently but firmly that I was too forgetful with the stove, that she did not want accidents, so she would handle the cooking. The refrigerator filled with food I did not recognize, while my own simple staples were pushed to the back, forgotten until they spoiled. The dining table became a battleground, for Patrick insisted that I should sit at the far end, away from the head of the table where he placed himself, as if by changing the seating he could rewrite the history of authority in the family. When I objected once, he leaned close, his voice low, so only I could hear, and told me that I ought to be grateful not to be eating alone in some nursing home. That word, nursing home, was like a knife, for it carried with it all the fears of being discarded, of ending one's days among strangers without dignity or memory of belonging. Yet what troubled me most was the subtle way he began to manage my affairs. It started with offers to help pay bills online, since computers were confusing, then requests that I sign forms so he could handle the utilities, then suggestions that my pension be deposited directly into an account he controlled for the sake of efficiency. Each time I resisted, he reminded me of the dangers of fraud, of how elderly people were easily taken advantage of, and how he only wanted to protect me. His words were smooth, but underneath them I sensed the tightening of a noose. One evening he set a stack of papers before me, saying they were routine documents to simplify household management, and though I tried to read them, the print swam before my eyes, and his impatience pushed me toward the pen. I did not sign, not then, but the uneasiness gnawed at me long after he left the room, the papers still lying there like silent threats. Through all of this, I tried to find comfort in my memories of Margaret, telling myself that she would want me to be patient, to believe in reconciliation. But sometimes when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear her voice warning me not to trust so easily, reminding me that strength does not always roar, but sometimes whispers in the refusal to yield. The house itself seemed to groan under the tension, its familiar walls now holding conversations filled with cold politeness, its hallways echoing not with the laughter of grandchildren, but with closed doors and muffled arguments between Patrick and Denise about money, about status, about how long they would have to put up with the old man before everything was finally theirs. I was not meant to hear those words, but I did, standing just outside the kitchen one night, and they pierced deeper than any insult spoken to my face. By the time autumn settled in and the leaves began to scatter across the yard, the transformation was complete. What had been presented as a temporary arrangement had become a hostile takeover, and I, once master of this house, found myself walking carefully in my own rooms, uncertain what might be moved, forbidden, or taken away next. Yet beneath the confusion and hurt, something else began to stir in me, a stubbornness that had not been called upon in years, a refusal to let the last piece of my life be stripped from me. I did not yet know how the conflict would unfold, but I felt, with the clarity of a man standing on a cliff edge, that the quiet days of endurance were over, and that soon there would come a moment when I would have to choose between submission and defiance. That moment, though I could not name it then, was already rushing toward me like a train on distant tracks, carrying with it the catalyst that would set everything aflame. The first signs that politeness had been abandoned and replaced by something darker came in ways so small that I almost convinced myself they were accidents, but soon the pattern grew too sharp to ignore, and the weight of those daily humiliations began to crush me. It was in the way Patrick corrected me in front of his sons whenever I tried to share a story from the past, cutting me off with a smirk and saying that Grandpa was confused again, or the way Denise would move my belongings from the places where I had kept them for decades, telling me that the house needed a fresher look, though what she meant was that the traces of Margaret and me were to be erased room by room. I would walk into the living room and find the family photographs replaced with their glossy portraits, my books boxed and pushed into the attic while shelves filled with meaningless ornaments took their place. And when I asked why, Patrick said that the old things made the house look like a museum. I wanted to tell him that those old things were the threads of my life, each one bound to a memory, but I held my tongue, for I knew that speaking would only invite another smirk, another condescending laugh shared between him and Denise, as if I were a child clinging to toys. The grandchildren, who at first had treated me with cautious warmth, began to follow their father's lead. When I offered to help them with schoolwork, they rolled their eyes, whispering that I was too slow to understand their subjects. At dinner, when I tried to lead grace as I had always done, Patrick interrupted and told them to hurry, that there was no need for long speeches, and the boys laughed while I lowered my head, the words dying in my throat. One evening, as I reached for the television remote, Patrick snatched it from my hand with a quickness that startled me, telling me that I should not watch the news because it upset me, that I ought to rest instead. And then he turned the screen toward a sports channel while the boys jeered at my silence. That was the moment I realized he was not only taking possession of the house, but also of my dignity, stripping away the small rituals that had once anchored my days until I felt like a stranger wandering in the ruins of my own life. The humiliation reached a sharper edge when I noticed that money was disappearing. At first it was small sums from my wallet, a 20 here or there which I thought I had misplaced, but then my pension check was deposited later than usual. When I asked the bank about it, I discovered that Patrick had changed the direct deposit to an account under his control. When I confronted him, he did not deny it, but instead raised his voice in mock indignation, accusing me of being ungrateful for his help and reckless with my finances, insisting that he was saving me from exploitation. He told me that elderly men like me were prey for scammers, that I should thank him for protecting me, and when I tried to protest that I had managed my affairs responsibly all my life, he slammed his hand on the table and told me sharply to stop, living in the past, that the world had changed, and I was too old to understand it. The boys stared in silence as their father spoke, and I could see in their eyes the beginning of contempt, the lesson they were learning that age was weakness, and weakness deserved no respect. It was not only words, but gestures, too, that deepened the wound. Once when I came into the kitchen and reached for a knife to slice bread, Denise snatched it from me with a smile that did not reach her eyes, saying that it was unsafe for me to handle sharp objects. Another time when I tried to sweep the porch, Patrick yanked the broom from my hands and told me to sit down before I gave myself a heart attack. And when I refused, insisting that I was still capable, he laughed loudly and told the boys to watch. Their grandfather trying to play strong as if I were a circus act meant for their amusement. The worst came one evening when he returned home in a foul mood, anger radiating from him like heat, and I made the mistake of asking if something was wrong. He stepped close, so close I could smell the beer on his breath, and with a suddenness that froze me, he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin, and whispered in a voice so cold that it sent a chill through me. "If you want to stay here, you'll crawl." The grip left bruises that blossomed dark on my flesh, and though I tried to cover them with my sleeve, I could not cover the shame that spread through me, the realization that my own son, the boy I once held against my chest, now saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle to be broken. After that night, the house no longer felt like mine in any sense. I moved carefully, afraid of provoking him, listening to his footsteps in the hall as one listens for the approach of a storm. At meals I ate silently, my appetite dulled by fear, while Patrick dominated the conversation with stories of his business, and Denise nodded approvingly as though rehearsing a role in a play. The grandchildren scarcely looked at me any more, except when they joined in the mocking chorus that echoed their father's words, asking if I needed help walking to the bathroom or if I remembered where my bedroom was. Each jab was a needle in my heart, not because of the insult itself, but because I could see in them the erosion of respect that once held families together, the severing of a bond that I had spent my life nurturing. In the stillness of the night, when I lay awake in the narrow bed Margaret and I once shared, I felt her absence more painfully than ever, for she would have known how to confront Patrick, how to pierce through his arrogance with the kind of quiet authority only she possessed. Without her, I felt adrift, a soldier without his comrade, but I also felt a stirring of something I thought I had lost, the will to resist. Each insult, each theft, each cruel gesture was not only a wound, but also a spark, igniting in me the slow, steady flame of defiance. I began to imagine what Margaret would say if she saw me submit, and the answer came clearly. She would not forgive me for letting our house, the symbol of our shared life, be taken without a fight. So I waited, watching, pretending to yield, while inside I was gathering strength. I noted where Patrick kept the documents he was so eager for me to sign. I memorized the times when the house was quiet and he was away, and I began to plan visits to places I had not gone in years. The bank, the notary's office, the lawyer who had once helped me draft a simple will. Each step would be careful, deliberate, for I knew that if Patrick discovered my intentions too soon, the hand that had bruised my arm could easily become a fist, and the threats whispered in the kitchen could become actions. Yet beneath the fear was a strange exhilaration, the sense that I was no longer merely waiting for the end, but preparing for a confrontation that would decide not only where I lived, but who I was. By the time winter's first frost glittered on the windows, I understood that the battle for my dignity had begun, even if no one else in the house recognized it. What Patrick saw as submission was in fact patience, and what he mistook for weakness was a gathering of resolve. The first escalation had already taken place, and though I bore the bruises of it on my arm and the scars of it on my heart, I also carried within me the certainty that the story was not yet finished, that I would not crawl, and that when the time came, I would stand. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon in late January when the snow lay heavy on the branches of the oak outside, and the house felt colder than it had in years, not because of the furnace, which still worked faithfully, but because the air inside seemed to carry the weight of hostility that no fire could dispel. Patrick had been pressing me for weeks to sign a new set of documents, papers that he insisted would simplify legal matters in case anything happened to me, but my instincts told me that these sheets of paper were less about protection and more about possession. So I stalled, pretending I needed more time to think, asking questions I already knew would irritate him, and watching the impatience gather in his face like a storm cloud. That day he came home early, his mood sour, his eyes flashing with the same hardness I remembered from the night he bruised my arm, and he told me flatly that the delay was over, that I would sign or I would regret it. I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before me, the ink of the notary's seal gleaming faintly in the light. And for a moment I thought of Margaret, of her voice telling me to stand firm, and I looked up at my son and asked him quietly why he was doing this. He laughed a harsh sound and said that the house was wasted on me, that I could barely keep it clean, that I was one fall away from the nursing home, and that he was simply taking responsibility as any good son should. But there was no love in his tone, no trace of the boy who once clung to my leg when thunder frightened him, only the arrogance of a man who had convinced himself that power was his right. When I hesitated, his temper flared, and before I could move, he reached across the table, seized my wrist with a grip that made me wince, and hissed the words that will never leave me. "You'll crawl if you want to stay." In that instant, the world seemed to narrow to the pressure of his fingers on my skin and the humiliation burning in my chest. But beneath the fear there was something else, a sudden clarity, as though every slight and insult of the past months had gathered into a single truth. If I gave in now, I would cease to be myself. I would become a shadow in the house I built, a ghost who lived only at his son's mercy. I pulled my hand free with more strength than I knew I still had, and I told him in a voice that shook but did not break that I would not sign. Not now. Not ever. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed with anger, and he stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door so hard that the photographs on the wall trembled. I sat there alone, my heart pounding, my arm throbbing, but for the first time in months I felt taller, as though I had taken back a piece of the ground he had stolen from me. That night I did not sleep. Instead I walked the house from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the framed pictures of Margaret and the children, and I realized that this was not simply about property, but about memory, about the preservation of a life lived with, love and sacrifice, and that to surrender it would be to betray not only myself but also Margaret, whose spirit I still felt in every corner. The next morning, while Patrick was away, I gathered the courage to act. I put on my heavy coat, slipped the deed and the unsigned documents into a folder, and walked slowly through the snow-covered streets to the office of an old acquaintance, a notary named Caldwell, who had handled minor matters for me years ago, and who still greeted me with the respect of one man to another rather than the thin patience reserved for the elderly. Caldwell listened quietly as I explained, his eyes narrowing as he examined the papers Patrick had tried to force on me. He shook his head and told me plainly that they were not routine forms at all, but a deed of transfer that would have signed the house over entirely to my son, leaving me with nothing more than the right to stay at his permission. My stomach turned at his words, though some part of me had already suspected the truth, and I asked what could be done. He told me that the original deed, the one Margaret and I had secured decades earlier, still stood strong in the county records, that the house remained legally mine, and that any attempt to force me to sign away my rights could be challenged in court. More than that, he advised me to consider placing a protective clause, ensuring that no transfer could take place without my explicit consent, a safeguard that would remind anyone who doubted that I was still master of my home. I left his office with the folder clutched under my arm and a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration in my chest. The confrontation at the kitchen table had been a wound, but it had also been a turning point, for it revealed the depth of Patrick's intentions and forced me to see clearly that there would be no peace bought by silence. As I walked back through the snow, the air biting at my face, I thought of the boy he had been and the man he had become, and I grieved for the loss of the bond that once bound us. But I also felt Margaret's presence beside me, urging me onward, reminding me that dignity once surrendered is rarely regained. By the time I reached the house, I knew that the struggle was no longer about whether I would resist, but how. The house loomed before me, the windows glowing with the light of the television, the faint sound of laughter from Denise and the boys spilling into the cold evening. But I did not hesitate as I mounted the steps. For the first time since they had moved in, I walked through the door, not as a guest, but as the owner, the man who had built these walls and who had just been reminded that the law itself still recognized his claim. I hung up my coat, placed the folder in a drawer where Patrick would not find it, and sat in the living room, listening to the sounds of his family filling the spaces that once belonged to Margaret and me. They believed I had yielded, that I was too weak to fight, but the truth was that the midpoint had been crossed and the story of my silence was over. From that moment forward, every day would carry me closer to the reckoning that awaited us both. If the moment at the kitchen table had revealed the depth of Patrick's intentions, the weeks that followed showed me just how far he and Denise were willing to go, and how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that the house was already theirs. What began as subtle manipulations turned into open acts of control, and each day seemed to strip another layer of dignity from me. Yet, paradoxically, with each humiliation, my resolve hardened further, for now I had knowledge on my side, knowledge that the deed remained mine, knowledge that the law still recognized me as the rightful owner, and this knowledge made every insult not simply an injury, but also a piece of evidence, a reminder of what I was fighting for. Patrick began to speak of the house as though it belonged to him, telling visitors who came by that he was taking care of the old place, and that soon they would be renovating, tearing down walls, opening up the kitchen, installing modern appliances. I listened silently as he made these pronouncements, each one a theft of memory, for those walls had been raised by my own hands, those appliances bought with Margaret's careful savings. But I kept my silence not from weakness, but from calculation. For Caldwell had advised me to remain calm, to gather proof of their behavior should matters ever come before a court. Denise, meanwhile, began to make comments about how lonely I seemed, how perhaps I would be happier in a retirement community where I could have friends my own age, and though she said it with a smile, the implication was clear. They wanted me out, and sooner rather than later. The grandchildren, too, grew bolder in their disrespect. One evening, when I entered the living room to find them sprawled across the new leather couch, I asked them politely to move their feet so I could sit. Instead, one of them laughed and said that this was their house now, and I could have the rocking chair in the corner, the one that creaked with every motion. Patrick, who overheard, did not correct them, but chuckled as though it were a harmless joke, and in that laugh I heard the confirmation of everything Caldwell had warned me. They were building a case not only in the courts of law, but in the court of perception, portraying me as a senile old man clinging to what no longer belonged to him. They spoke of me in the third person while I was in the room, remarking on my forgetfulness, exaggerating small slips of memory, and once I even heard Denise whisper to Patrick that if I kept deteriorating, they might have grounds to declare me incompetent. The word sent a chill through me, for incompetence would mean guardianship, and guardianship would mean the house legally in their hands. One night I found the proof of their intentions more plainly than ever before. I had gone to bed early, pretending fatigue, but unable to sleep. I rose and walked softly down the hall. From the half-open door of the study I heard their voices, low but urgent, and I stopped, my heart pounding, straining to catch their words. Denise was saying that once the deed was signed, they could remortgage the house, take out a loan large enough to cover their debts and fund Patrick's latest business venture. Patrick replied that I was stubborn, that he might have to push harder, and Denise said coldly that if I resisted, they could always take me to a doctor, get some papers signed, and have me declared unfit. The casual cruelty of her tone made me grip the wall for support, and I realized then that this was no longer simply about greed, but about the erasure of my will, the reduction of my life to a set of signatures and diagnoses that would strip me of the right to decide my own fate. The escalation was not only in words, but in actions. One morning I discovered that my checkbook had gone missing, and when I asked Patrick, he waved it off, saying he had taken it for safekeeping. Later that week I found that the small box where I kept Margaret's jewelry, her wedding ring, and the locket she wore every Sunday, had been moved from my dresser to the locked cabinet in the study. When I confronted Denise, she smiled and said that it was better to keep valuables secured, that she was protecting me from burglars, though I knew well enough that the only burglars in the house were standing before me. My protest grew sharper, but so too did Patrick's responses, his voice rising, his body looming over me, his words dripping with the suggestion that I was ungrateful, irrational, and dangerously close to losing the privilege of staying. That word, privilege, stabbed deeper than any insult, for it revealed what he truly believed, that my presence in my own home was a conditional gift from him, revocable at any moment. The most painful moment came when I overheard him telling one of his sons that men must sometimes be ruthless, that weakness must be cut away like rot, and though he did not say my name, the boy's glance toward me made it clear who he meant. To hear my own son teaching my grandson that their grandfather was nothing more than weakness to be excised was a betrayal so deep that I nearly wept on the spot. But I held my composure, retreating to my room where I sat in the dark, clutching Margaret's photograph and whispering to her that I would not let them win, that I would honor the life we built by defending it until my last breath. Yet even in my despair, fate provided me with an unexpected ally. One afternoon, as I walked slowly to the corner store, bundled against the cold, I encountered Mr. Hawkins, an old neighbor who had lived across the street for decades and who knew Patrick from boyhood. He greeted me warmly and asked how things were at home, and though I hesitated, the concern in his eyes drew the truth from me. I told him in halting words of the pressure, the missing belongings, the threats. He shook his head grimly and said that he had suspected something, that he had seen the way Patrick barked orders when unloading the car, the way Denise looked at the house with ownership rather than respect. He advised me quietly to be careful, to keep records of everything, and offered to be a witness should I ever need one. His words were a balm, a reminder that I was not entirely alone, that the world beyond those walls still contained people who saw me as more than a burden. That night I resolved to act more boldly. I returned to Caldwell and told him everything, every insult, every theft, every threat, and he listened intently before advising me to secure my affairs legally. He helped me draft a document affirming my full ownership of the property, notarized and filed in county records, and he suggested I prepare a statement of my mental competence, signed by my doctor, to counter any attempt to declare me unfit. It was a humiliating thing to prove that I was still in command of my mind, but I swallowed my pride, for I knew it was necessary. And when the doctor, after a thorough examination, declared me perfectly sound, I felt a surge of vindication, a weapon placed in my hands against their schemes. The tension at home grew unbearable. Patrick sensed that I was resisting, that I was no longer the passive old man he had hoped to control, and his temper flared more often. He raised his voice at dinner, he slammed doors, he barked orders at the boys, and once, when I refused to hand over my bank card, he pounded the table so hard that the plates rattled and Denise's eyes flickered with something like fear before she masked it with her usual cold smile. I kept my documents hidden, my plans secret, but inside I was preparing for the day when the confrontation would come to light. I no longer prayed for peace, for I understood now that peace was impossible with people who saw me only as an obstacle. Instead, I prayed for strength, for clarity, for the endurance to see this struggle through. And then came the moment when all pretense dropped. Patrick returned one evening with a lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit, and they sat across from me at the kitchen table, spreading papers once again before me. The lawyer spoke smoothly of efficiency, of simplifying inheritance, of avoiding complications down the road. And Patrick folded his arms, his eyes daring me to refuse, but I did refuse. I told him calmly that I had already secured my deed, that I knew exactly what those papers meant, and that no force on earth would make me sign. The lawyer looked startled, then annoyed, and Patrick's face flushed with rage. He leaned forward, his voice low and trembling, and said that if I wanted to play stubborn, he could make things very difficult for me. I met his gaze without flinching, and though my hands trembled under the table, my voice was steady as I told him that this was my house, my life, and that I would not crawl. The silence that followed was thick as ice, broken only when Denise rose abruptly, gathering the papers, and declared that the conversation was over for now. They left me sitting there, my heart pounding, my body shaking from the confrontation. But inside me, the fire burned brighter than ever. The escalation had reached its second stage, and though the storm ahead would surely be fierce, I knew that I was ready, that I had the law, my memories, and the unyielding strength of Margaret's spirit behind me. Whatever they planned next, I would endure, and I would answer, not with silence but with defiance, for the battle for my dignity had entered its most dangerous phase, and there was no turning back. The day of reckoning arrived in early spring, when the snow had melted into heavy mud that clung to the boots and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. A season when life stirs again, yet when old rot also reveals itself, and it was in that uneasy season that Patrick made his final attempt to claim the house by force of law and intimidation. For weeks the atmosphere had been unbearable, his anger smoldering just beneath the surface. Every glance a challenge, every word sharpened to remind me that he believed the end of my independence was near. I had heard the hurried phone calls at night, the whispers with Denise, the complaints to his lawyer, and I knew he was preparing something decisive, yet I remained outwardly calm, carrying myself with the stillness of a man who has already chosen his ground and is waiting for the enemy to cross it. It was a Friday when he announced without asking that we were going together to the notary, that everything would be settled at last and that resistance was pointless. He tried to dress it in the language of duty, telling me that the family needed clarity, that it was time to stop living in the past, that I should trust him as a son. But there was no warmth in his words, only command, and as I looked into his face I no longer saw the boy I had raised, but a man who had allowed greed to hollow him out, a man who could grip his father's arm hard enough to bruise and call it love. I said nothing, for silence was my shield, and I let him believe he was dragging me to my surrender, when in truth I was walking toward the moment that would free me. The notary's office was a plain brick building on Main Street with windows that overlooked the small square where Margaret and I had once strolled after church, and as we entered, a strange calm settled over me, as though every step had already been written. The notary Caldwell greeted us politely, his expression unreadable, though when his eyes met mine there was the briefest flicker of recognition, a silent signal that the preparations we had made in secret were ready to be unveiled. Patrick marched ahead, spreading his documents on the table with the pride of a conqueror, Denise at his side with her polished smile that hid the sharpness beneath, and I sat quietly, folding my hands, my heart steady. The proceedings began with Patrick speaking loudly about responsibility, about protecting me, about ensuring that the estate would not be tangled in confusion. He gestured to the papers as if they were gifts rather than shackles, and the lawyer he had brought nodded along, smoothing the path with practiced words. I let them speak, listening as one listens to the droning of a storm before it breaks, and when the moment came for me to take the pen, Caldwell cleared his throat and asked, with deliberate clarity, whether I understood the consequences of signing away my property. Patrick answered for me, his impatience boiling over, insisting that of course I understood, that it was all routine. That was the moment I raised my head, straightened my back, and in a voice that cut through the room like a blade, I said that I would not sign, that I never intended to sign, and that before anyone presumed to speak for me, the notary would read aloud the deed that remained in my possession. The room fell silent, a silence so deep that I could hear the tick of the clock on the wall, and then Caldwell, with a steady hand, opened the folder I had entrusted to him weeks earlier. His voice was calm, but carried weight as he read from the document, affirming that the property was still legally mine, that my ownership was full and uncontested, that any attempt to transfer it without my explicit consent was void. As the words rolled through the room, Patrick's face drained of color, then flushed red with fury, and Denise's smile faltered into something sharp and bitter. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them and Caldwell, realizing that the trap they had laid had collapsed beneath their feet. Patrick tried to interrupt, shouting that I was confused, that Caldwell was mistaken, that I was not capable of handling such matters. But Caldwell held up a hand and presented the medical statement from my doctor, notarized and official, declaring, "Me fully competent of mind and able to manage my own affairs." The force of it struck like a hammer, and Patrick's voice cracked as he sputtered, his words tangled between rage and desperation. Denise leaned close to him, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. The notary's authority stood like stone, and in that room, for the first time in years, the truth was undeniable. I was not a burden to be managed, but the rightful master of my life and my home. I stood then, slowly but without hesitation, feeling every ear in my bones, yet also every ounce of strength that Margaret's memory had left me. I looked at my son, at the man who had once held my hand as a boy, and I told him in words that did not tremble that this house was built with my sweat, that it was filled with the echoes of my wife's laughter, that it was the soil where family had once taken root, and that I would rather die within its walls than crawl out of it on my knees. The weight of silence followed, broken only by the sound of Patrick slamming his fist against the table, his fury unchecked. But even that noise was powerless, for the law, the truth, and my own voice had already settled the matter. When it was over, Caldwell closed the folder and looked at me with quiet respect, and I nodded, knowing that what had just occurred was more than a legal victory. It was the reclaiming of my dignity, the moment when the whispers of humiliation and the shadows of fear were burned away by the simple act of standing tall and speaking the truth. Patrick stormed out, Denise hurrying after him, their lawyer trailing in embarrassed silence, and I remained a moment longer, resting my hand on the polished wood of the table, breathing deeply. For months I had lived under the weight of their schemes. For months I had endured the slow erosion of respect. But in that room, as the notary's voice read my deed aloud, I felt restored, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. And I knew that no matter what battles remained, the tide had turned. I walked out into the bright afternoon, the sun breaking through the clouds, and though my steps were slow, my heart was light. The confrontation that had haunted my nights had come and passed, and I had not crawled. I had not yielded. I had stood tall, and in doing so I had honored not only myself but also Margaret, whose memory was the true foundation of the house. Whatever Patrick and Denise plotted next, they would know now that their father was not so easily broken, and that dignity, once reclaimed, could not be stolen again. The days that followed the confrontation at the notary's office felt strangely quiet, as though the storm had passed, but left the air heavy with its aftertaste, a silence not of peace, but of retreat. Patrick and Denise returned to the house with their faces tight and their voices clipped, speaking to me only when necessary, their tones laced with the bitterness of those who had expected triumph, and instead tasted humiliation. I no longer engaged with them in argument, for the matter was already settled. The law had spoken, and the notary's voice had carried a finality that no amount of shouting could undo. Yet in their eyes I saw something that unsettled me, not only anger, but the realization that I had become a presence they could not dominate. And from that day forward the balance in the house shifted. Patrick withdrew into long silences, his temper flaring at small inconveniences, while Denise busied herself with the children, her smiles sharper than knives, her words brittle with disdain. The boys avoided me, ashamed perhaps, or merely following their parents' lead, and so the house became a place of strained coexistence, a battlefield where the weapons had been laid down but the hostility lingered like smoke. I carried myself with quiet dignity, walking the rooms with a steadiness that reminded them daily that I was not defeated, that I was still the master of the home, and each time my eyes met Patrick's, I held his gaze until he looked away. It was a small victory, but it was mine, and in those moments I felt Margaret's presence beside me, as though she too were standing against them. It was not long before they announced their departure. One evening, after weeks of cold silence, Denise informed me that they had found another place to rent, that they would be moving out at the end of the month. Her tone carried no gratitude, only bitterness, as though leaving were a punishment I had forced upon them rather than the inevitable result of their own schemes. Patrick said nothing, only stared at the table as if carved from stone, but his silence was louder than words, for it carried the weight of defeat. I nodded, offering no resistance, and when they finally left, the house was filled with the clatter of boxes and the shouts of boys dragging their belongings. But beneath the chaos was a growing sense of release, the air lightening as though the house itself were breathing again. When the door finally closed behind them and the sound of their car faded into the distance, I stood in the quiet hall, the rooms bare once more, and felt a profound stillness settle over me. It was not loneliness, not the hollow ache I had known after Margaret's death, but a different kind of silence, one that carried respect rather than contempt, one that allowed me to walk freely through my own rooms without fear of mockery or intrusion. The house belonged to me again, not merely by deed but in spirit, and as I moved from room to room, touching the furniture, opening the curtains, and letting the light pour in, I felt as though I had reclaimed not only my home, but also the years that had been overshadowed by their presence. Neighbors who had watched from a distance began to approach me again, offering warm greetings, small gestures of kindness, and words that confirmed what I had suspected, that they had seen more than they had let on, that they had noticed the tension, the sharpness in Patrick's voice, the way Denise carried herself as though the house were hers. They told me they were glad to see me walking tall again, that the place already seemed brighter, and I felt a quiet pride in knowing that even if my family had turned against me, the wider world still recognized my dignity. I began to accept their offers of company, sharing meals, walking slowly through the neighborhood, and in these small acts I felt life stirring once more, the heavy shroud of fear lifting at last. Now, as I sit on the porch in the evenings, the same porch where Margaret and I once dreamed of the future, I no longer dwell only on what has been lost, but also on what remains. The house stands firm, the walls holding the laughter and sorrows of a lifetime, the oak tree leaning still toward the roof as though bowing in silent respect. And within me burns the certainty that I did not surrender, that I did not crawl, that I stood tall when it mattered most. My son may carry his bitterness, and perhaps the wound between us will never heal, but I know that I have preserved the essence of who I am, and in that knowledge there is peace. I will not pretend that the ordeal left me unscarred. The betrayal of blood cuts deeper than any enemy's blade, and the memory of his grip on my arm, his whispered threat, will never fade entirely. Yet scars are proof of survival, and survival is its own quiet victory. I have chosen to remain here in the house that Margaret and I built, to live out my days not as a tenant in my own life, but as its rightful master. And when the time comes for me to leave this world, it will be on my own terms, within these walls, surrounded not by fear or humiliation, but by the echoes of love that no betrayal could ever erase.